So good morning. I want to thank Don McIntyre and Becky Miller for showing up today. They'll speak a few words at the conclusion of my comments this morning. We've got support from Vern White of Oregon Tax Research and Josh Foxhall. Joe Foxhall, sorry. Which affiliation are you? Executive Club. Great. So they'll be able to handle the really tough questions about specific details on particular measures. The pioneers who first came to Oregon didn't come here because John McLaughlin offered more government handouts and more government interference in their lives. They came here because they believed that life in Oregon offered more freedom and more opportunity to build better lives for their families. The territorial government basically had two functions: protecting the settlers from attack and providing a court system to handle criminal prosecutions and contract disputes. In short, the original Oregonians were libertarians, at least in practice. Since that time, and especially in the last 20 years, things have completely changed. Republican and Democratic elected officials compete with each other to see who can spend the most money on government programs that are sold as helping people. In fact, those programs have the opposite effect. They hurt the very people they are designed to help. They do that in two ways. First, by taking money out of the private economy via excessive taxes, and second, by creating a culture of dependency and entitlement that crushes individual drive and ambition. The leadership in Oregon has consistently demonstrated that it is incapable of disciplining itself to reduce the rate of spending growth on its own. This is no surprise. If you look at the list of partners included in creating the governor's last budget proposal, you will find not a single representative of the taxpayer's interest. All of them are dedicated to one goal: increasing the amount of taxpayer money allocated to their particular program. As a result, state spending increases have consistently exceeded the rate of increase in state income. In 2001 through 3, for example, the state's own figures show income levels increasing by 12%, which is a remarkably high figure, and spending levels increasing by 15%. That is unsustainable, unnecessary, and just plain wrong. That's why I'm standing here today, to express my unreserved, enthusiastic support for Measures 8 and Measure 91. I believe I'm the only statewide candidate who takes such a position. Measure 8 constitutionally limits spending to no more than 15% of Oregonians' income. 15% is more than adequate to fully fund the legitimate functions of state government, especially education. Measure 91 eliminates the immoral practice of imposing taxes on taxes. There's simply no excuse for that practice, and it should be eliminated. These measures, which are very likely to pass, are good for Oregonians and good for government. Many will disagree with that assessment. Their arguments are fundamentally flawed. They're acting in their own self-interest, not in the public interest, and I will oppose them. Don and Bill have appropriately refrained from suggesting specific spending changes in response to their measures. They point out that spending decisions are the legislature's job, not their job. However, as a candidate for statewide office, I believe it's incumbent on me to take specific positions on spending alternatives. In your press kit is a proposed budget and supporting justifications regarding my proposals. I want to address a couple of highlights. I'm proposing holding overall education spending constant in the next biennium. However, I've already proposed selling significant state lands like the Tillamook Forest and using the proceeds to augment the Common School Fund and create low-income matching scholarships that parents can use to send their children to the school of their choice. I'd like to see overall education spending redirected along similar lines instead of being used to feed the voracious state education monopoly. That practice has clearly failed. It's time to give competition a chance to radically improve education results. The rest of the budget reflects the application of ideas from the Cato Institute, the Cascade Policy Institute, Oregon Tax Research, and my own extensive business experience. I know from experience that competitive privatization and personal responsibility are the best ways to address society's needs, not armies of bureaucrats. That's what this budget reflects. Don?
I just want to congratulate Mitch Shults for being a candidate for office that has no hesitation about supporting legitimate ideas to control the, as he expressed, the outrageous growth and unrestrained growth of government. We appreciate that. We well know that most people who are candidates for public office become the immediate servants of the lobby, which is essentially people who have vested interest in expanding the domain of government. So we're very happy to have a prominent candidate, a clearly bright person, great intellect, making a conscious decision to support a constitutional protection or protections that will definitely improve the lives of Oregon citizens and enhance their economy, which he knows, and I know, by the way, is ultimately very good for the government. Thank you, Mitch.
You know me from my work at Oregon Taxpayers United. I spend probably 12 hours a day fighting for the interest of taxpayers, so that's my life. And as an advocate for taxpayers, it is my great privilege and honor to endorse Mitch Shults as the candidate for state treasurer. I think he'd do an excellent job. Mitch's support for our Measure 91 shows some really important things about him. First of all, he respects the will of the voters. 3 times voters have already spoken on this issue that they do not want a cap on their federal income taxes. Not only that, but polls show about 2/3 support for this measure. So Mitch is the only candidate out there who's listening to the will of the people. He isn't a politician. He's one of us. And Mitch has come down with a firm position on the side of taxpayers to limit the growth of government. One thing I really admire about Mitch is that even though he works for Intel, and Intel has come out against Measure 91, Mitch is willing to stand up anyway, put his job, I suppose, probably not on the line, but you know, in other words, stand up despite his company's position and still say what he believes. And a lot of people think that, I probably shouldn't even say this, but I'm going to anyway. I hear it a lot when I talk to people about the Libertarian Party, and they say, well, if Libertarians were in office, they'd be different. They'd fold just like the Democrats and the Republicans do. But I think that this shows very clearly that that's not the case, because we have a very strong example right now of a Libertarian who is standing up in an atmosphere that is in opposition to his own personal views, and yet he's not changing his position. And there are a number of Republicans out there that are running for office who support Measures 8 and 91, but are saying that they oppose them specifically because they are politicians and they're not one of us. Mitch is running against a liberal Democrat and a squishy Republican. And I want to point out, especially with Mr. Kvistad, a couple of things. He has no respect for the will of the voters, who 2 times opposed light rail funding, yet he's out there pushing for light rail funding and backing that. He is not a friend of the taxpayers, and I would strongly urge Republicans not to advance the career of John Kvistad by putting him into this office. He's not somebody who will represent the things that Republicans believe in. Mitch, again, is not a politician. He's a businessman. He's out there working in the area of finance and business right now and doing a great job at it. And he's the kind of person we want managing the state finances. It's way too important of a position to be trusting it into the hands of somebody whose first and primary concern is advancing his political career. Oregonians have a very real, legitimate choice in November with a candidate that can win this race. And I can tell you, Kvistad would not win this race. It is a throwaway vote to vote for John Kvistad. It's not a throwaway vote to vote for Mitch Shults. I'm especially pleased with his plan to privatize a good number of state lands. And the reason for that is right now about 2/3 of the state belongs in the hands of the government. And that means it's not paying property taxes. That puts the entire property tax burden on 1/3 of landholders. And that's a huge burden. And all of us have, at Oregon Taxpayers United, have been focused for years on trying to control property taxes, as has Don McIntyre. One very good way to do that is to do as Mitch suggests and sell some of these public lands into private ownership. Not only would that generate more property tax revenue, but spread out the burden over a lot greater area and reduce the burden on homeowners. And of course has the added benefit of providing more income for the schools at no extra cost to taxpayers. So for these reasons and many others, and I won't go on and on, again, I'm very pleased to endorse Mitch Shults for state treasurer.
Mitch, if I may, I just want to make this one comment, because Becky said something that I don't know that you can amplify on, but she said that Intel is against our measures. I'm not necessarily sure that's the right way to state the case. I believe the Intel CEO may be, but I know that they did not poll the employees of Intel nor the shareholders in coming to an opinion. So I want to give you that cover.
Yeah.
You're not going totally against company policy, I don't believe. You may be pissing off the CEO.
I expect to get a few emails out of this, but Intel is 14,000 people in the state of Oregon. I'm one of those 14,000. I have my own opinions. So do most of the people at Intel. Managing Intel is kind of like herding cats sometimes, but the reality is that in my experience, most of the people of Intel actually do support these measures. I expect them to vote for them. That's anecdotal. I haven't done a poll, but the people I work with are very much in favor of this. So we've talked for a lot. There's doubtless some questions.
I haven't read all this, but is the bottom line of your budget within the 15%
Yes.
spending cap that Don wants?
It's actually below it. Not a whole lot below it, but it is somewhat below it. Yes.
I wonder if you could, I'm sorry for being late and asking you to repeat.
That's okay.
But, I mean, explain how both of these measures fit into the libertarian philosophy. I mean, I think libertarian, I think social policy, but you're talking about economic policy, is that right?
Right. Fundamentally, libertarians stand for fiscal conservatism and social liberty. On the latter point, I suspect I disagree with some people in this room, but that's not the focus of the current discussion. We're the only party that can be counted on to act on the fundamental principle that government does best when it interferes the least in the lives of individuals and in particular in their economic activities. Whenever you take money away from people, if you were to do that, they would call it stealing. When government does it, they call it taxes. But by taking that money away from individuals, you remove their ability to save and invest and conduct their business as they see fit. That results clearly, as any qualified economist, and I am one, will tell you, in a reduction in net economic activity and makes the society overall poorer. We fundamentally stand for eliminating as much as possible of that interference, increasing economic freedoms, and as a result, improving the lives of everyone. Now, that's sometimes uncomfortable for a lot of people. It's easier to point to government programs and claim that they help everyone. It's tougher to point to the separate activities of millions of people out there in the economy making their own private decisions and trust that those private decisions will result in better overall welfare. However, Adam Smith probably said it best, there's an invisible hand driven by economic self-interest that leads to better outcomes for everyone. It is an absolute, demonstrable economic fact. And whenever government interferes in that, they reduce the net welfare of the society overall.
What do you think of Jim Johnson's argument that when more than half the state budget goes to education is good for business, particularly high-tech business for the year in?
I understand why he's saying that. Intel is having an incredibly tough time finding adequate numbers of qualified individuals to fill the open positions. That's certainly a difficult thing for us. Intel has undertaken, along with the community colleges in Portland, a series of scholarship grants for up to over 500 people to become manufacturing techs. 237 have signed up for it. That was not a government-sponsored program. Nobody forced Intel to do it. The reality is that there's a motivational issue out there. These are well-paying jobs, but it's tough to learn how to be a manufacturing tech. It takes some work. It's probably easier to do other things. I'm speculating as to motivation, why it's difficult to fill it, but I question whether it's appropriate to subsidize through taxpayer funding those kinds of activities. Far better for individuals to be motivated to fulfill their own ambitions. One example, the Children's Scholarship Foundation, a private organization that funds educational scholarships for low-income individuals, the primary source of my ideas for the Common School Fund notion. They fund over $100 million of private scholarships a year, totally privately funded. And one of their key requirements, and this is for low-income individuals, low-income families, is that those families, before they receive a scholarship, must be willing to commit $1,000 of their own limited incomes to matching those grants. They have an extensive waiting list of highly motivated parents who are willing to make that commitment in order to give their children an opportunity. I have to believe that children raised in that kind of an environment who've made a personal commitment will have better outcomes than those who are simply given things.
I'm sure other people have questions. I don't mean to be asking so many, but are you saying that the state should not be involved in funding public schools?
I proposed a different approach to funding funding education in general, and that is to greatly facilitate the ability of parents to make their own choices about where they send their children. I believe that the money needs to follow the child directly through the parents, not through the education bureaucracy, because that simply results in more inefficiency and less positive outcomes. The overall amount of funding, I believe, will ultimately fall because you don't need as much when it's spent more efficiently, given a certain level of population. But I'm not explicitly proposing that. What I'm suggesting is that the legislature needs to look at increasing programs like charter schools, like tax credits and scholarships for low-income individuals, to create an environment where there is real competitive choice amongst education providers. It's only if we do that that we will ever see improved educational outcomes in the environment. Throwing more money at the education bureaucracy simply will not work.
You said that you're not proposing less money for schools, but
No.
aren't you? I
No.
mean, if you're endorsing these
Same number.
measures.
This budget has exactly the same number that was proposed by the legislature.
Can you talk a little bit about state lands, just looking at the paper, right, okay. Building the common school fund, state
Right.
lands. So what are you, how much of this are you proposing to sell? And I'm assuming you mean sell to developers or not?
Well, one of the differences between this suggestion and the current practice, for example, an environmental group is forbidden by state and federal law from bidding on any timber sale. They can't buy it and hold it, even if they want to. I disagree with that. And this program would basically open these lands to the highest bidder. So if the Natural Resources Defense Council, which spends $800 million a year nationwide on lobbying politicians to spend taxpayer money to preserve lands, were to take some of that funding and put their money where their mouth is and buy critical habitat for spotted owls and salamanders and so forth within the Tillamook Forest, I would let them do that. They have to compete for it, but they'd be free to.
Then how many thousands of acres are you talking about?
I don't know the exact figure for total acres within the Tillamook Forest itself, but that's the whole Tillamook Forest. There's roughly, according to the biological reports I've read, there's about 112,000 separate ecosystems within the forest overall. I have no idea how they measure that stuff. My ecosystem biology lessons stopped in 4th grade. But
So when you say
they do
state
measure it.
lands, is that what you mean, really, the Tillamook Forest? Or is
That's
there
the
more?
primary one. That's the granddaddy of them all. But it would include things like underwater lands, The people who live on houseboats are incredibly victimized by the state land board today, who are the monopoly provider of dock facilities. And every time they need more cash, they raise rents. And they've done it consistently since time immemorial. And frankly, the houseboat owners are pretty perturbed about that. And unlike renters in general, they can't just pick up and go somewhere else, because if they go somewhere else, it's still the state as their landlord. That's one example. Rangelands are another example. It's demonstrably true from experience in a number of western states that privately owned rangelands are much better managed, both in terms of wildlife and livestock and stream beds and everything else that people care about when they are owned by private landowners, not leased from the government. Basically, private ownership gives people an incentive to preserve and augment the asset, because they just might want to sell it in the future. If they destroy it, they're hurting themselves. That's not true for government assets. If you're a timber company and you have bought a timber sale, you don't own the underlying land. You have absolutely no interest in protecting that land except what regulatory authority dictates you must. If you destroy it, it's not yours. Who cares? You haven't devalued your asset. If you own it, it's different. Another suggestion that's in the budget, kind of buried if you look at some of the details, is elimination of the watershed board, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And I justify that by the following argument. If property rights were appropriately defined and respected and enforced by private legal action, there'd be no need whatsoever for a government regulatory authority to intervene. A specific example, if salmon fishermen had a property right in salmon, as New Zealand fishermen have a property right in the orange roughy population, which, by the way, has totally recovered after almost going extinct, thanks to that program, then if a timber company or any other form of development upstream damages the watershed and the reproductive habitat for the salmon, the fishermen would have a cause of action legally against that company and could collect damages for it. I think there's a good and productive use that all those hordes of U.S. lawyers can be put to. And it's not lobbying the government, it's enforcing private property rights.
What about the idea, though, that if a portion of state lands owned by government now are, subject to scrutiny, more public scrutiny, versus if they were bought up, say, by private owners?
I'll tell you a little story. This is my direct experience from the travails of a politician trying to raise money for a campaign. I called the executive of one of the timber companies that's in Tillamook County, and I said, hey, it occurs to me that you would probably like to see the state lands, state forests opened up for your access competitively versus other timber companies and environmental interests, but in an open marketplace. I'd like your support. He says, I'd love to support you. It's the right answer for the forests from a long-term forest management standpoint. It's the right answer for me economically, for my company. But if I support you, the environmental groups are going to attack me because of the misperception that public scrutiny protects forests. It doesn't. Just look at the 55 million acres of western rangelands and forest lands that burned this year thanks to government mismanagement of those assets. And this is the key and, I've already made contributions to the more likely winners of this race, and I'm confident that I'll receive special access to the next timber sale that happens in my area thanks to those contributions. The bottom line is that when the public owns those assets and politicians govern their use, the process is corrupted. And the result is that the asset becomes less valuable over time, not more valuable. It happens time after time after time. Unfortunately, it doesn't get reported nearly as widely as it needs to. It's simply a myth that government protects the environment.
Since you got onto campaign fundraising, how's your goal? As I remember in our first press conference, you talked about 600,000 as your goal, 200,000 of your own, and raising 400,000. If I remember.
That was my goal, yep.
How are you doing on that?
I haven't achieved that result. The C&E report will come out, boy, like now. The submission was yesterday. And unfortunately, I didn't look at it, so I can't answer your question precisely. It's in the order of tens of thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars above what I had raised last time. And yeah, it's proven more challenging to raise money for the kinds of reasons that I just cited from corporate interests than I would have liked. I've done pretty well with individuals. I'm doing a series of fundraisers over the fall. We'll be doing a statewide media campaign, television, radio, newspapers, over the next few weeks. So we're going to play at this, but I'm not in a position to just open the checkbook.
But you're still spending $200,000 of your own money?
That's what we got.
Ballpark figure about how much you've raised from private sources?
It's in the low tens of thousands of dollars beyond that, 40 or 50 total. I don't know the exact figure. It's in the C&E report, which you can get. It's online.
I'm sorry about that, because your deadline is actually October 9th. It's not yesterday. That wasn't the deadline. That was the opening. That
Oh.
was when you could first submit. Is
Well,
that
then we
understood?
went too fast because we submitted it yesterday.
Since you are active in November, and I'm
It
sorry.
might
I
be
was-
confusing with parties too, Lisa, because parties have different filing deadlines than candidates.
Right, but as a candidate, he's not due until
I
October.
believe there's another filing due later, but I'm not the treasurer of my campaign, so don't test me on this one.
Okay, let me ask you this.
If your primary closed up, you had to file yesterday. If you continue the campaign on to the general, you don't have to file till
Yeah.
October.
Oh,
Okay. So then, getting back.
yeah, I could have used that information.
Colin probably asked this already, but you had raised 200,000 in the primary. Were you talking about you're contributing an additional 200,000 to that, or not?
I haven't made any additional contributions at this time. I don't view it as necessary. We're running a competitive campaign right now versus the activity level that the other guys are doing. You'll see my big highway signs up all over the I-5 corridor and 84 and around the state. You'll see a statewide media campaign with TV, radio, cable, and internet, and print advertising activities. I expect that positions like this will generate some coverage, and we're in the debates on a regular basis. So people will know who I am, and they'll know where I stand, and that's what getting the message out is all about. So.
I'm sure you've gotten this question before, but what do you say to people who compare you to Al Mobley, although you may not, as
I don't know Al Mobley.
Well, the effect that he had on the 1990
Gubernatorial race.
1990 gubernatorial race.
Help me out here,
was
Richard.
to- was
Who
to-
was this
Al
guy?
Mobley,
11%.
Al
third
Mobley
party.
ran as an independent and was largely the reason that Dave Frohnmeyer did not
Okay.
make it.
Well, in this
He got
particular
13%.
race, if Kivistad loses because I'm in this race, I'm not going to cry over it. In my view, Edwards and Kivistad are fundamentally indistinguishable in terms of their positions. In fact, Edwards is probably the more competent and experienced individual. I'm more competent and experienced than either of them or both of them combined. But you asked the question, I'm not going to cry in my beer if the result of my participation is that Kivistad loses. Yeah, Vern.
Worldwide Oregon tax research, I did some numbers the other day in the public safety area and discovered that it costs $44,000 per year to keep somebody in the penitentiary. It costs $107,000 a year, count them, $107,000 a year, to have someone incarcerated by the Oregon Youth Authority people. And I'm curious as to whether you think maybe we could privatize some of this to advantage.
They putting them up in the Hilton Hotel or what?
Rose-covered
It's
cottages.
$214,000 biennium.
It's amazing. Vern, that's exactly what this budget reflects in terms of correction spending in the Oregon Youth Authority. Privatization is the essential aspect of that. Private prisons have taken a hit recently in the press regarding escapes and so forth. The reality is they do a far better job than they're given credit for at much lower cost to taxpayers. They do make mistakes. They've overbuilt the number of prison cells in anticipation of increased population. There's about 4,000 empty prison cells that private prison contractors have constructed. I'm sure they would they'd probably offer a discount to house the Oregon Youth Authority folks. So I totally support that effort. Privatization is the way to go for those activities. Competitive privatization. If you simply privatize to another monopoly, you've accomplished nothing.
Well, I hope they publish this verbatim, because this is good.
So Mitch, you're not worried about like cases like, I mean, I know this because this is my hometown, Youngstown, Ohio, the private prison capital of the world where prisoners escape all the time. There have been several murders, and it's been a disaster there. You don't think that would happen here?
I don't know the specifics of that situation, so I can't really comment about what went wrong. I used to live in Texas. The death penalty capital of the world at this point, near the Huntsville State Prison, and they had escapes all the time, including of a death row inmate. And fortunately, he drowned in the river, saving taxpayers money. But anytime you have people incarcerated against their will, they're going to try to escape. Now, the private prison system has a contractual responsibility that's enforceable by contract, and they are liable for damages in the event that, or they should be, in my view, I don't know if the contracts read that way, but they should be liable for damages that are incurred as a result of prisoners escaping. So they have every financial incentive, both legally and practically, to limit that. Prisoners are crafty, escapes will happen, but there's no fundamental reason to believe, in fact, there's every reason to believe that state-run prisons will be less efficient at that. Perhaps not as widely reported, but given the incredible lobbying power of the prison unions, I suspect that we have a case where one group is getting more widely reported, and the results are in fact inferior in state-run prisons. That's speculation on my part, but I bet you it's true. I'm Director of Business Development in one of the divisions of Intel. I put investment money into startup companies that are doing technology that we believe is complementary. Intel is actually one of the largest venture capitalists in the world, and I'm associated with that organization. Just don't ask me what direction Intel stock's headed in. Or what PC to buy. I always get those questions too. All right, looks like we're done.
You might note that in Oregon, which has a state-run system, it hasn't been that long ago since one of the convicts stabbed the superintendent of the entire prison system to death. So, state or private, they have.
Yeah.
The numbers.
They're dangerous people.
The guy from Ohio, what happened when the people escaped? Didn't somebody get sued?
Common school fund.
I don't know.
That's a question we
I don't
can
know.
ask him.
Private sector.
Thank you, Lisa.
He's a reporter.
Okay, thanks very much.